The alarm on my desk screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light. Priority signal. A survey team was down on a planet we had rated as one of the worst environments in known space, and 3 names on that casualty list belonged to people I had argued about for years. I am Doran Vex, and before that moment, I was just a records officer nobody listened to. After that moment, everybody wanted to know why I had been right. Let me take you back further, because you need to understand how we got here. Long before any of this happened, my job was simple. I worked inside the Interstellar Compact's Xenobiological Classifications Office, in a building so quiet you could hear your own pen scratching against a data slate. My task was to look at new worlds, study the data sent back by scout probes, and decide how dangerous they were. Every planet in compact space gets a rating. Calm worlds with mild weather and no real predators get marked safe for open settlement. Worlds with serious dangers, crushing gravity, toxic air, monstrous wildlife, get marked as death worlds, which means heavy restrictions, armed escorts, and constant caution for anyone who sets foot there. Then there is the category in between, Deathworld-Adjacent. It sounds almost harmless when you say it quickly, doesn't it? That is exactly the problem. The planet that started all of this was called Earth, and the species living there called themselves humans. When their file landed on my desk, I remember leaning back in my chair and reading it twice, because I thought someone had made an error in the data. Their planet was a nightmare on paper. Earthquakes strong enough to swallow buildings. Storms that could tear through solid structures and vanish just as fast as they came. Oceans filled with creatures that could kill in seconds. Forests filled with predators, built for nothing but hunting, and an atmosphere so thick with living things that danger was not the exception, it was the rule. On most planets like this, intelligent life simply never manages to develop. The pressure is too high, the threats too constant. Evolution runs out of chances before it can build anything close to a civilization. Humans not only survive that pressure, they spread across every single biome on their world. Frozen wastelands, burning deserts, dense jungles thick with predators, mountain ranges with air too thin to breathe properly. They were everywhere, not hiding from the danger, not clinging to the safest corners of their world. Everywhere. According to every rule I had been trained to follow, that should have placed Earth firmly in the death world category. But there was a strange twist in the numbers, one that our scoring system was never built to handle properly. The system assumes that if a species has to fight constantly just to stay alive, that species will be shaped by fear. Cautious, slow to trust, suspicious of strangers. The system also assumes that a species this successful, spread this wide, adapting this fast, must be doing it through comfort and safety rather than constant struggle. It cannot imagine both existing at once. But that is exactly what humans were. A species born into constant danger that never actually taught them to be afraid of danger. Instead, somewhere along the way, danger became normal, ordinary, just another Tuesday. That single detail is why Earth was marked Deathworld-Adjacent instead of a true death world. Adjacent status means less oversight, fewer restrictions, easier trade and travel agreements. The logic on the review board was almost lazy. If a species survives constant threats without needing to constantly prepare for war, they reasoned, then that species must not actually be dangerous, just tough, resilient, not risky. I did not agree, and I said so in the only way a records officer like me was allowed to say anything. I attached a note to the bottom of the file, 1 line long, easy to skip if nobody was paying attention. Recommend reclassification review, pending behavioral data. That was it. That was my warning. A single sentence buried under pages of atmospheric readings and predator counts. The kind of note that gets filed away and forgotten the moment somebody stamps approval on the report above it. Nobody read it. The file was approved within a week. Earth was marked safe enough for full diplomatic contact, safe enough for trade routes, safe enough to treat like any other developing world with interesting but manageable challenges. My supervisor at the time, a calm and unbothered official named Threll, told me not to worry so much about a species we had barely spoken to yet. "You are seeing danger in survival data," Threll told me. "That is not the same as seeing danger in a person." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something about the file stayed with me, the way a splinter stays under skin, small enough to ignore most days, sharp enough to notice every time I moved wrong. Contact happened not long after. Compact ships met human ships somewhere near the edge of their solar system, and for a while, everything seemed to prove Threll right and me wrong. Humans were friendly, curious, endlessly talkative. They asked questions about everything, wanted to trade recipes as much as technology, and treated first contact with an excitement that felt almost childlike compared to the careful, guarded manner most species use when meeting strangers for the first time. They did not act like a species shaped by a violent world. They laughed easily. They shared stories. They seemed, if anything, disarmingly harmless. I filed my addendum again anyway, quietly, almost out of habit at that point, the way you check a lock on a door, even after years of nothing going wrong. It would take one small, strange mission on the edge of compact territory to make anyone finally listen, and by the time they did, 3 people were already trapped in a canyon, on a planet that had earned its Deathworld rating the honest way, waiting to find out if being human actually meant something after all. The years after first contact were quiet, in a way that made my warnings feel foolish, at least on the surface. Compact merchants opened trade posts on human soil. Diplomats exchanged long, friendly meetings with human leaders. Scholars from both sides traded knowledge about medicine, engineering, art, and history. Everything about the relationship looked calm, cooperative, and safe. But I read the field reports that came back from the officials stationed on Earth, and those reports told a different story than the polished summaries that reached the review board. A diplomat named Laura Whitmore, stationed in a coastal human city, wrote about watching a group of local children swim in open water where enormous predatory fish were known to live. She described the fear she felt watching from the shore, certain she was about to witness a tragedy. Instead, the children swam, laughed, splashed each other, and climbed back onto the sand as if nothing dangerous had happened at all. When she asked the parents nearby why nobody looked concerned, one of them simply told her that the fish rarely bothered people who did not act like food. "Rarely," Laura wrote in her report. "Not never. Rarely. And they let their children swim there anyway." Another officer, a logistics coordinator, named Peter Halloway, wrote about a human family who kept a massive predator as a household companion. Not a small domesticated creature bred over generations to be gentle, but a powerful animal with teeth built for tearing meat, an animal that could easily overpower an adult human if it wanted to. Peter described watching a small child fall asleep against the creature's side while it rested calmly, almost protectively, nearby. He admitted in his report that he had never seen anything like it on any other world in compact space, a species living side by side, at ease, with something that could kill it without much effort. Reports like these kept arriving. Humans freediving into deep ocean trenches for enjoyment, descending into darkness and crushing pressure with nothing but their own held breath and a rope, simply because they found it thrilling. Humans climbing sheer cliffs with nothing but their bare hands and a length of rope, risking a fall that would end everything, and calling it a hobby. Human children camping alone in dense wilderness, treating survival skills as games rather than desperate necessities. I collected every one of these reports and attached them to my old addendum, resubmitting the file again and again. Reclassification review, pending behavioral data, I wrote, and now I had pages of behavioral data to support it. Real accounts, real witnesses, not guesses. Each time, the review board sent the file back with the same answer. Behavioral observations do not override established environmental scoring, the official response read. Comfort with risk is not equivalent to inherent danger. I began to understand the deeper problem, the one buried underneath all the paperwork. It was not that the review board disagreed with my data. It was that they simply could not imagine a friendly, cooperative, endlessly cheerful species being anything other than harmless. Humans smiled easily. They shared their food with visitors. They asked thoughtful questions about our cultures and seemed genuinely delighted by every new thing they learned. A species that behaved that warmly could not possibly also be dangerous, in the eyes of people who had never actually needed to test that theory. I disagreed, quietly, endlessly, and mostly alone. Threll, my supervisor, eventually stopped even reading my resubmissions before rejecting them. He told me once, not unkindly, that I had built an entire career around a footnote nobody else cared about. "Perhaps you should let this one go, Doran," he said. "Not every warning needs to be proven right." I wanted to let it go. I truly did. But there was a pattern in front of me that I could not unsee once I noticed it. Every single report described the same thing in different words. Humans were not simply surviving dangerous situations. They had stopped recognizing danger as danger at all. Somewhere in their long, brutal history, the line between threat and normal life had blurred so completely that an activity which would terrify almost any other species barely registered to them as risky. That is not bravery in the way most species understand bravery. Bravery usually means feeling fear and acting anyway. What I was reading about was something else entirely. A complete absence of the fear response in situations where fear should have been the very first reaction. I remember writing a private note to myself around that time, one I never submitted to anyone, because I knew exactly how it would sound if I did. A species that no longer notices danger is not a safe species. It is a species whose warning system has gone silent, and silence is not the same as safety. Meanwhile, out on the edges of compact territory, expansion continued the way it always does. New worlds discovered, cataloged, and assigned for survey missions. Most of these worlds required teams of specialists, and increasingly, human volunteers were being included on these missions, not as equal scientific partners, but in a role the compact considered almost menial: environmental consultants. Local guides, support staff meant to advise on survival conditions while compact scientists carried out the real work of cataloging new discoveries. It made a strange kind of sense to the people making these assignments. Humans had grown up dealing with dangerous conditions their entire lives. Who better to send along on a mission to a hostile, unstable world than a species that treated hostile, unstable conditions as ordinary? Nobody worried much about sending humans into danger, because humans never seemed particularly worried about it themselves. I read the mission assignment when it crossed my desk during a routine review, the way I read every document that mentioned humans by that point, out of habit as much as concern. A survey team was being sent to catalog a newly discovered world near the border of human and compact space, a planet already flagged with every marker of a genuine death world. Extreme terrain, violent weather patterns, aggressive megafauna confirmed by initial scans. 3 senior compact scientists would lead the mission. 2 human consultants would accompany them, assigned to advise on movement through dangerous terrain and to help the team avoid unnecessary risks. I remember staring at that file for a long time. Something about it felt wrong in a way I could not fully explain, even to myself. It was not that I thought the humans would fail at their job. It was the opposite feeling entirely. I worried that the moment real danger arrived, the 2 people trained their entire lives to treat danger as background noise would be the only ones on that mission who did not panic, and that everyone else's survival might end up depending entirely on people the compact had never bothered to properly understand. I submitted one final note before the mission departed, attached quietly to a file nobody would read until it was already too late to matter. Recommend closer monitoring of behavioral response during high-risk field operations involving human personnel. Environmental comfort should not be mistaken for absence of danger. The mission launched 3 days later. I did not think about it again until the alarm on my desk started screaming. The planet was called Kesserine 4 in the survey logs, a name so ordinary it gave no hint of what waited on its surface. Thick clouds of a strange yellow color hung permanently over jagged mountain ranges. Winds strong enough to knock over heavy equipment swept through the lowlands without warning. The wildlife scans showed enormous creatures moving beneath dense canopy cover, predators with body structures built for speed, strength, and little else. Every early scan confirmed what the initial classification already suspected. This was not a place for careless mistakes. The survey team landed in the early hours of the planet's short daylight cycle, setting up a base camp near the edge of a wide ravine that cut through the northern forest like an old wound in the ground. Leading the mission was a senior compact scientist named Halvin Doss, a careful and methodical researcher known throughout the department for his caution. Alongside him were two other compact specialists, a geologist and a biologist, both experienced in dangerous fieldwork but unfamiliar with a world quite this hostile. The two human consultants assigned to the mission were a man named Daniel Ashcombe and a woman named Grace Fenwick. Daniel had spent years working search and rescue operations in mountain regions back on Earth, hauling stranded hikers out of conditions that would have terrified most people. Grace had a background in wilderness survival training, the kind of work that involved teaching others how to stay alive with almost nothing, in places where almost nothing was all you had. Neither of them had ever worked directly with the Compact before. Both had been recommended for the mission specifically because they treated extreme environments as something to be managed carefully, rather than something to be feared. For the first 2 days, everything went exactly as planned. The team moved through the forest cataloging plant life, taking soil samples, mapping the terrain with careful precision. Daniel and Grace walked ahead of the group most of the time, reading the ground, the wind, the sounds coming from deeper in the trees, calling out warnings whenever something felt off. Halvin admitted later, in the reports gathered afterward, that he had been impressed by how calm the two humans remained, even when unfamiliar sounds echoed through the canopy at night. It gave the rest of the team a strange sense of confidence, he wrote, as if danger simply could not reach them while Daniel and Grace stood watch. On the third day, that confidence nearly killed all of them. The team had been following a narrow ridge along the edge of the ravine, moving toward a rock formation the geologist wanted to examine more closely. The wind had picked up that morning, stronger than the previous days, but not unusual enough to raise immediate concern. Grace had noted it in her log, describing it as worth watching but not yet dangerous. The ground gave way without warning. Later analysis suggested that the storms sweeping through the region over the previous days had weakened the rock beneath the ridge far more than any scan had detected. One moment the team was walking single file along solid ground. The next moment, a section of the ridge simply collapsed beneath Halvin, the geologist, and the biologist, sending all three tumbling down into the ravine in a chaos of loose rock and dust. Daniel and Grace had been walking slightly ahead when it happened. Grace's recorded comm log, recovered later from her equipment, captured the first several seconds after the collapse with startling clarity. There was no scream of panic in her voice, no frozen silence either, just immediate, sharp focus. "Status," she said instantly, into the open channel. "Halvin, report your status." A weak voice answered from somewhere below, Halvin's voice, strained but conscious, confirming that he and the biologist were alive, but pinned beneath fallen rock, with the geologist unconscious nearby and bleeding from a wound on his head. The ravine dropped nearly 40 meters from the ridge, its walls unstable, loose stone still shifting and falling even as Grace and Daniel reached the edge to look down. What happened next, according to every report gathered afterward, was not what anyone expected from two people suddenly facing a life-threatening rescue with almost no equipment and no backup for hours. Daniel did not hesitate. He began stripping gear from his pack immediately, calling out instructions to Grace, in short, clipped sentences that sounded almost casual despite the situation. "Rope," he said. The reinforced line, not the standard one. Grace already had it in her hands before he finished the sentence. Their exchange, recorded on the open channel, reads almost like two people discussing a familiar chore rather than a rescue in progress. "Anchor point here," Daniel said, pointing toward a thick outcropping of stone near the ridge's edge. Grace tested it with her full weight, nodded, and began securing the line without a single wasted movement. Communications back to base camp captured Halvin's own voice from below, weak but astonished, asking if help was on the way. Daniel's response was almost light-hearted given the circumstances. "Working on it," he said. "Try not to move too much. The rock down there isn't finished falling yet." What followed was nearly 20 minutes of careful, controlled effort that later reports described as remarkable. Daniel lowered himself down the unstable ravine wall using nothing but the rope, his own strength, and small handholds in the crumbling rock, all while loose stone continued shifting around him. Grace remained above, managing the line, watching the wind, calling out warnings whenever a fresh section of the ridge threatened to give way. Halvin's account, given afterward once he had recovered, described watching Daniel descend toward him and feeling a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. "He was talking the entire time," Halvin said, not shouting instructions in fear, talking, almost calmly, about how the rock here reminded him of a mountain back on his own world, one he used to climb for enjoyment. "I remember thinking, even as I lay there certain I was about to die, that this man seemed to be having an easier time than I was." Once Daniel reached the bottom of the ravine, he assessed the situation quickly. The geologist needed immediate attention for his head injury. The biologist was pinned beneath a slab of stone too heavy to move alone. Halvin himself had a fractured leg and could not stand without support. Daniel radioed back up to Grace, with a plan formed in seconds rather than minutes. "Grace," he said, "I need you to rig a second line for a stretcher pull. Can you manage the anchor alone up there?" "Already on it," she answered. What the reports make clear, again and again, is that neither Daniel nor Grace ever raised their voices in panic during the entire rescue. They spoke to each other the way experienced partners speak during difficult but familiar work. Adjustments were called out. Problems were solved out loud, one after another, without hesitation, without freezing, without the kind of fear response that might have slowed anyone else facing the same danger. Daniel worked to free the biologist first, using a length of pipe from his own equipment as a lever to shift the heavy slab of stone just enough for the biologist to be pulled free. The effort left him breathing hard, his hands scraped and bleeding, but he did not stop moving. He turned immediately to the unconscious geologist, checking his injuries, stabilizing his head as best he could with the limited supplies in his pack, all while continuing to call updates up to Grace. Above, Grace managed the rope system entirely alone, hauling equipment down and injured team members up through a combination of careful rigging and sheer physical effort, all while continuing to monitor the unstable ridge for further collapse. At one point, a fresh section of rock gave way dangerously close to her anchor point. Her recorded response to the sudden danger was a short, sharp warning shouted down into the ravine, followed immediately by a calm adjustment of her position, moving the anchor to more stable ground without ever losing control of the line she was managing. It took nearly 2 hours to bring all 3 compact scientists safely up out of the ravine, stabilize their injuries, and get an emergency signal out to the orbiting support ship for immediate evacuation. By the time the rescue shuttle arrived, Daniel and Grace had already splinted Halvin's leg, stopped the bleeding from the geologist's head wound, and kept the biologist calm despite a dislocated shoulder, all using nothing but the basic field supplies they had carried with them that morning. Halvin's official statement, given once he had recovered enough to speak clearly, became one of the most quoted lines in the entire incident report that followed. "I have worked field missions on 11 different worlds across my career," he said. "I have seen trained emergency teams respond to crisis situations with less composure than these two showed. They did not behave like people facing a disaster. They behaved like people finishing a task they had done 100 times before." That single sentence, more than any data set or behavioral survey I had submitted over the years, was what finally forced the review board to take my warning seriously. Because Halvin meant it as praise, and it was praise, well-earned and completely deserved. But when I read his statement afterward, Sitting alone at my desk with the rescue reports spread out in front of me, I felt something colder settle over the relief I should have felt at 3 people surviving. They had done 100 times before, Halvin had said, describing a rescue that would have overwhelmed almost any other species with fear. For humans, this was not an extraordinary act of courage under pressure. This was simply how they operated when the ground fell out from beneath them, in every sense of the phrase. Calm, immediate, almost cheerful competence in the face of conditions that should have terrified them. My old addendum had finally been proven correct, in the worst and best possible way at the same time. Humans were not dangerous because they meant harm. They were dangerous because they had entirely stopped recognizing danger as something separate from ordinary life, and nobody in the compact had ever built a classification system capable of understanding what that truly meant, until 3 people fell into a ravine on a hostile world and were rescued by 2 humans who treated the entire experience like an unusually interesting afternoon. I stood outside the review chamber doors for a full minute before walking inside, holding a data slate with years of rejected addendums finally bound together into a single formal case. It was strange to feel nervous about a hearing I had been requesting for so long that I had almost stopped expecting it to happen. But the rescue on Kesserine 4 had changed everything, and now the same board that once dismissed my footnote without a second glance had summoned me directly, eager to hear the full argument they had ignored for years. The chamber was large, circular, lined with seats for senior officials from across the Compact's classification division. Threll sat near the front, his expression unreadable, though I noticed he did not meet my eyes when I walked in. Halvin was there as well, still recovering from his injuries, seated slightly apart from the others as a witness rather than a judge in this particular proceeding. I began the way I always began, with the same simple statement I had written years earlier at the bottom of an ignored file. Earth was misclassified, I said, and the mistake was never about the planet's environment. It was about what that environment did to the species living on it. I laid out the full picture, piece by piece, the way I had rehearsed it 100 times in my head over the years, without ever expecting anyone to actually listen. I explained the original scoring system and its blind spot, the assumption that comfort and calm behavior automatically meant an absence of danger. I explained how that assumption had been built for species shaped by fear, species who behaved cautiously because caution had kept them alive, and how the entire model simply broke down when applied to a species whose relationship with fear had become something else entirely. Humans are not calm despite the danger of their environment, I told the room. They are calm because the danger of their environment stopped registering as danger a long time ago. Their homeworld did not teach them caution. It taught them that catastrophe is simply part of an ordinary day, something to be handled rather than feared. One of the senior officials, a stern woman named Vessa Trell, interrupted before I could continue. "Are you suggesting humans are a threat to the Compact, Officer Vex?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to carry a challenge inside it. I answered carefully, because I had asked myself the same question many times before ever walking into that chamber. "No," I said. "I am suggesting something more complicated and more important. This was never about threat. It was about miscalibration. We built an entire policy framework assuming that behavior tells us everything about risk. For humans, it tells us almost nothing, because their behavior no longer reflects the actual danger of the situations they walk into." I gestured toward Halvin, still seated quietly among the witnesses. "Ask him," I said. "Ask him whether the 2 humans on that mission behaved like people who understood they were facing a life-threatening emergency." Halvin answered without needing to be prompted twice. "They understood it perfectly," he said. "They simply did not experience it the way the rest of us would have." There is a difference between recognizing danger intellectually and feeling it the way it is meant to be felt. I watched 2 people perform a technically flawless emergency rescue while discussing mountains they used to climb for fun. That is not the behavior of people who are afraid. That is the behavior of people for whom fear has stopped being a useful signal. A murmur passed through the chamber at that, and I felt the mood shift slightly, though not entirely in my favor. Another official, a calm and thoughtful man named Corvin Ash, raised a point I had expected someone to raise eventually. "Officer Vex," he said, "if humans are as capable and composed as this incident suggests, is that not simply an argument in favor of trusting them more, rather than restricting them further? You are describing extraordinary allies, not dangerous unknowns." It was a fair question, and I did not dismiss it. "They are extraordinary allies," I agreed. "I am not proposing that we treat humans as enemies, or restrict their movement, or handle them with suspicion. That would be as much a mistake as ignoring the addendum I filed years ago. What I am proposing is smaller, and I believe, far more important. We need to stop using human comfort as a measurement of actual risk in any situation. If a human tells you a mission is manageable, they are telling you the truth as they understand it. But their understanding of manageable was shaped by a world that would have killed almost any other species 1,000 times over before it ever reached adulthood. Their baseline for danger is simply not our baseline, and until now we have been building policy as though it was." Vessa Trell studied me for a long moment before speaking again. Her earlier sharpness softened slightly by something closer to genuine consideration. "What would you have us do differently?" she asked. "Practically speaking." I had thought about this question more than any other over the years, turning it over during quiet evenings at my desk long after everyone else had gone home. "I do not believe Earth needs a harsher classification," I said. "Deathworld status would be inaccurate and unfair, given how cooperative and valuable human partnership has already proven to be. What I believe we need is an entirely new category, one that does not currently exist in our framework, because until humans arrived, we never needed it." I described what I had in mind as clearly as I could. A classification for species whose homeworld conditions were severe enough to eliminate the fear response for situations that would still be genuinely dangerous to almost anyone else. Not a warning about the species itself, but a warning about how to interpret that species' own judgment during high-risk situations. A note attached to every joint mission, every survey assignment, every emergency protocol involving human personnel, reminding everyone involved that a human sense of safety could not be relied upon the same way a compact citizen's could. Junior staff in the classification office, once word of the hearing spread through the department, had already started calling the proposed category by an informal nickname that stuck faster than any official term ever could. Native-adjacent, they called it, a quiet joke that captured the idea more precisely than most formal language managed to. A species whose own world had failed, in the end, to teach it proper caution, simply because nothing on that world had ever been survivable enough to make caution feel necessary rather than optional. The debate that followed the formal proposal ran long, filling most of the remaining session with arguments from officials on every side of the issue. Some worried the new classification would insult a species that had proven itself to be a genuine and valuable ally. Others worried that failing to adopt some form of new protocol would eventually lead to another incident, one where human composure under pressure might not be enough to prevent real tragedy. Corvin Ash pointed out, fairly, that any new system would need careful wording to avoid sounding like an accusation rather than an observation. Vessa Trell, somewhat to my surprise, became one of the proposal's strongest supporters by the end of the session, arguing that a warning about miscalibrated risk perception was simply responsible policy, regardless of how capable the species in question happened to be. Threll spoke only once during the entire hearing, near its end, when the discussion had mostly settled into the shape of a real decision rather than an argument. He looked at me directly for the first time since I had entered the chamber. "You were right, Doran," he said simply. "Not about danger. About miscalibration, exactly as you described it just now. I dismissed your addendum for years because I could not imagine a friendly species being anything other than what it appeared to be on the surface. I understand now that friendliness and risk were never actually connected in the way I assumed they were." I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded, and the hearing moved toward its final vote not long after. The proposal passed, not unanimously, but with enough support to move forward into formal policy development. Earth would keep its existing classification unchanged, avoiding any insult to a partnership the compact clearly valued. But a new supplementary designation would be created alongside it, one meant to travel with humans into every joint mission from that point forward, quietly reminding everyone involved of something my original addendum had tried to say years earlier, buried under a stack of paperwork nobody had bothered to read at the time. Comfort is not the same as safety, and a species that has stopped noticing danger is not a species without danger around it. It is simply a species whose warning system has gone quiet, waiting for someone else to notice what it no longer can. A great deal of time has passed since that hearing, enough that I now find myself in a very different position than the quiet, mostly ignored records officer who once attached a single sentence to the bottom of a file nobody wanted to reread. My name gets mentioned occasionally in training materials now, usually in connection with the Kesserine incident, usually framed as an example of why careful observation matters even when the data does not fit expectations. I still find that strange, given how many years I spent being told to let the matter go. The new supplementary designation, once it moved through formal policy development, became a quiet but permanent fixture of how the compact handles joint operations involving human personnel. Officially, it carries a long and fairly dry title, the kind only a bureaucracy could produce. Unofficially, the nickname coined by junior staff during the hearing stuck permanently, and even senior officials use it now without a hint of embarrassment. Native adjacent status travels with every mission briefing where humans are present, attached as a simple, unassuming note near the bottom of the operational summary. The wording, after several rounds of careful revision, ended up simpler than I expected, and more honest than most policy language usually manages to be. Human personnel comfort level during high-risk operations should be treated as a lagging indicator of actual danger, not a reliable safety signal. Environmental caution should be maintained by accompanying compact personnel regardless of human assessment. In plain terms, it means exactly what I had been trying to say for years before anyone finally listened. If a human tells you a situation feels manageable, believe that they mean it sincerely. Just do not assume it means the situation actually is manageable for everyone else standing beside them. The reaction from humans themselves, once the details of the classification debate eventually became public knowledge through official channels, was not at all what I expected. I had quietly worried, during the months following the hearing, that humans might feel insulted by the implication that their own sense of safety could not be trusted the way a compact citizens could. Instead, when the story spread through human communities, both on Earth and among human crews working alongside compact personnel across the frontier, the response was something closer to amusement than offense. Laura Whitmore, the diplomat whose early report about swimming children had first caught my attention years earlier, sent me a message not long after the news became public. I still remember the tone of it, warm and a little teasing, entirely unlike the cautious diplomatic language she usually used in her official reports. So it turns out we are technically classified as a species that has forgotten what danger feels like, she wrote. Honestly, that tracks. Daniel Ashcombe, once he returned to active fieldwork after the Kesserine mission, apparently began introducing himself at new assignments with a small joke that spread quickly among human consultants working across compact territory. Officially Deathworld-Adjacent, he would say, shaking hands with new colleagues, unofficially just used to it. It became something of a running phrase among human crews, worn almost like a badge rather than a warning, a small piece of self-aware humor about a homeworld that had shaped them into exactly the kind of people capable of climbing down into a collapsing ravine and calmly discussing old hiking trips while saving 3 lives at the same time. Grace Fenwick, when I eventually had the chance to speak with her directly during a follow-up review of the Kesserine incident, put it more plainly than anyone else had managed to. "You are not wrong to be cautious around us," she told me. "We probably would tell you a burning building was fine to walk into if we genuinely thought we could handle it. The difference is, most of the time, we actually can. But you are right that we are terrible judges of when that will not be true, because nothing on our world ever gave us enough failures to learn where that line sits. We just kept surviving the ones that should have taught us to be more careful. That single conversation, more than any formal policy document, felt like the true resolution to everything I had spent years trying to explain to people who did not want to hear it. Humans were not dangerous because they meant harm, and they were not reckless in any way that suggested carelessness or disregard for consequences. They were simply shaped by a homeworld so relentlessly demanding that ordinary caution had been worn down into something closer to instinct, dressed up as calm confidence. A species that survived by treating catastrophe as routine will always struggle to recognize the exact moment routine finally becomes catastrophe again. The compact, to its credit, adjusted reasonably well once the new designation became standard practice. Joint missions involving human personnel now include additional environmental safeguards managed by non-human team members specifically, precautions that exist quietly in the background regardless of how confident or relaxed the human members of any given team happen to feel about the conditions around them. It has, according to every follow-up report I have reviewed since, prevented at least 2 incidents that likely would have gone the way Kesserine almost did, situations where human composure nearly convinced an entire team that a genuinely dangerous situation was perfectly under control. I think about my original addendum often, that single overlooked sentence sitting quietly at the bottom of a file years before anyone cared to read it properly. Recommend reclassification review, pending behavioral data. It feels almost embarrassingly small now, considering everything that eventually grew out of it. A policy shift, a formal hearing, a designation that now travels quietly alongside every human crew working within compact space. But I have come to believe that most important warnings start out exactly that small. A short note easy to overlook, a pattern noticed by one careful observer long before anyone else is ready to take it seriously. A single line buried under pages of data that everyone else considers more important, right up until the moment it turns out to be the only thing that actually mattered. My final note on the matter, the one that finally got read all the way through instead of skipped over, sits now at the end of the official closing report on the entire classification review. I wrote it the same way I wrote my very first addendum all those years earlier, simple, direct, and hopefully impossible to ignore this time. Reclassification of Earth as a standard death world is not recommended and would misrepresent the nature of the species living there. The true finding of this review is not about how dangerous humans are. It is about how completely they have stopped noticing danger at all. The compact should stop asking what humans can survive. We already know the answer to that question, and it has never once been in doubt. The far more useful question, the one we should have been asking since the very beginning, is simply this: what have they stopped noticing, and who is watching closely enough to notice it for them? I do not know if we will ever fully answer that question. I am not certain humans could answer it themselves, even if we ask them directly, because the things a person stops noticing are, by their very nature, the hardest things for that person to see. But at least now, finally, somebody is paying proper attention, and sometimes, I have learned, that is the only warning a warning ever really needs to be.